You buy one good jacket. Nothing extreme. Just a little better than what you usually wear. You put on, stand in front of the mirror, and notice something small. The jeans still fit. The shoes are fine. But together, they don't feel right anymore. You don't make a decision. You just hesitate. You start mentally rearranging what you own. What could be replaced? What suddenly feels old? Nothing is broken. Nothing is urgent. Yet somehow, the jacket doesn't feel like the end of the purchase. Most people believe their spending starts with a decision, a moment where they stop, think, and choose. But that's rarely how it happens. It usually begins much earlier in quieter ways. You don't wake up wanting more. You wake up wanting things to feel normal again. The jacket didn't create desire. It created contrast. Suddenly, items you never questioned start sending signals. Not loudly, just enough to be noticed. A mismatch here, an inconsistency there. Nothing that feels urgent, but nothing that feels settled either. This is where the illusion forms. It feels like freedom, like taste evolving, standards improving. But what's really happening is simpler. The environment has shifted, and once it does, your choices start responding to it automatically. You're not chasing more. You're trying to restore balance. Once the balance shifts, something takes the lead. There's always one item that sets the tone. Not the most expensive thing you own, just the most visible. The jacket, the new chair, the upgraded phone on the table. It becomes the reference point, even when you're not thinking about it. Everything else starts orbiting around it. Objects that used to feel neutral begin to feel temporary. The shoes aren't bad, but they don't belong to this version of you. The bag still works, but it feels like it belongs to a different life. You don't feel pressure, you feel friction. That's how the anchor works. It doesn't demand attention. It just raises the floor, quietly, without asking. And once that floor rises, anything below it starts creating tension. You don't replace things out of desire. You replace them to stop noticing them. This is the subtle shift most people miss. The purchase is over, but the system is just beginning. From here on, every decision feels small and reasonable. Each one makes sense on its own, but together, they start pulling in the same direction. Nothing feels excessive until you step back and realize you're no longer choosing what enters your life. You're adjusting to what already has. In the mid-1700s, a French philosopher named Denis Diderot lived a simple life. Not because he was disciplined, but because his world was coherent. His clothes were old. His furniture was worn. His desk was scratched. Nothing matched. Yet everything belonged together. And within that mismatch, there was comfort. Then one day, everything shifted. Diderot received an unexpected sum of money, enough to change his circumstances overnight. With it, he bought a single indulgence, a scarlet dressing gown. It was elegant, expensive, immaculate. When he put it on, he felt different. Not richer, just elevated. That's when the room changed. The robe didn't fit the space it entered. Sitting at his desk, Diderot noticed the stains, the scratches, the decay, not because they were new, but because they were now visible. The desk felt unworthy of the robe, so he replaced it. The new desk made the rug look cheap. The rug made the curtains feel wrong. One by one, the room began to reorganize itself around that single garment. Months later, the simplicity was gone. The harmony was gone, and so was the money. Diderot later wrote that he had been comfortable before the robe arrived, and constrained after it did. What changed wasn't his taste. It was his baseline. The robe didn't improve his life. He rewrote it, and without realizing it, he stopped owning his possessions. He began maintaining them. Diderot didn't lose his money because he liked nice things. He lost it because the robe changed how everything around him was supposed to look. The same pattern plays out now, just faster and on a larger scale. Today, objects don't just enter our lives. They arrive preloaded with meaning. When someone buys a certain kind of car, wears a certain kind of jacket, or lives in a certain kind of space, they aren't just making a purchase. They're stepping into a category. And once that happens, expectations quietly follow. Not from other people, from within. A person who sees themselves as practical feels comfortable in worn shoes and an old watch, but shift that identity slightly, and the tolerance disappears. The shoes still function. The watch still tells time. Yet they no longer belong to the same version of the story. The discomfort isn't logical. It's symbolic. This is where spending stops being about objects and starts being about alignment. Every item becomes a signal. Does this fit who I am now? Does this match the level I've stepped into? The more visible the upgrade, the louder these questions become. Not because anyone asked them, but because inconsistency feels like exposure. That's why upgrades rarely stay isolated. One change raises the standard, and the rest of life begins negotiating with it. Clothing leads to environments. Environments lead to routines. Routines lead to habits that cost more to maintain. None of it feels dramatic in the moment. Each step feels justified, even necessary. Over time, identity hardens. What began as a small improvement becomes a rule set. You start protecting the image without realizing you're doing it. Choices narrow. Flexibility disappears. And slowly, the space for ease shrinks. The mistake isn't wanting better. It's not noticing when better starts deciding for you. Most people know the price of what they buy. Very few understand the cost. Price is what appears on the tag. Cost is what follows a home. The chain reaction begins the moment a new standard is introduced. One improvement makes the rest of the environment visible in a way it wasn't before. Not because anything broke, but because contrast did the work. What once blended in now stands out. And standing out creates pressure. A kitchen is renovated. New cabinets go in clean, modern, bright. On their own, they feel complete. But beside them, the old refrigerator looks tired. It still works, still cools, still does its job. Yet it doesn't belong. The floor becomes noticeable. The lighting feels dim. The paint feels old. The renovation doesn't stay contained. It spreads. Each step seems reasonable. No one stands in a half-renovated room and decides to stop. The environment begins asking questions, and the only way to quiet them is to answer with upgrades. By the time the process ends, the original plan is unrecognizable. What started as one improvement has reorganized the entire space, and the budget with it. This same logic applies everywhere. A new laptop quietly demands a better desk. The desk demands a cleaner room. The room demands storage. A better wardrobe reshapes social expectations. A better car reshapes how weekends are spent. The initial purchase becomes the anchor around which future decisions rotate. This is why upgrades feel expensive long after they're paid for. The cost isn't concentrated. It's distributed. It leaks into categories that were never part of the original decision. And because each expense arrives separately, it avoids scrutiny. No single moment feels irresponsible. Looking back, it's easy to say the total was obvious. In real time, it never is. The system hides itself by appearing reasonable at every step. That's what makes it dangerous. Not excess, but logic. If the first upgrade had never happened, the dissatisfaction wouldn't exist. The floor wouldn't feel outdated. The fridge wouldn't feel embarrassing. The life would feel coherent. The money didn't disappear because of one bad choice. It disappeared because coherence became expensive. There is a point where the relationship changes. It doesn't arrive with a feeling of regret and doesn't feel like a mistake. Most people don't even notice when they cross it. One day, the object you bought to serve you quietly becomes something you serve instead. At first, it looks like care. You're more careful where you place things. You're mindful of spills, scratches, fingerprints. You adjust your behavior slightly, just enough to keep things looking right. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that feels like a sacrifice. But over time, those small adjustments begin to stack. A new couch changes how people sit, who you invite over, what food feels safe in the room. A new car changes how far you park from other vehicles. A new jacket changes how freely you move through the day. You hesitate before leaning, before sitting, before relaxing. Not because you're anxious, but because the object has raised the cost of being casual. This is where ownership quietly flips. The object is no longer neutral. It now requires protection, maintenance, planning. You begin factoring it into decisions that used to be automatic. Routes are chosen to avoid damage. Activities are filtered through risk. Ease becomes something you negotiate instead of something you have. What makes this shift hard to see is that it feels responsible, careful, adult. You tell yourself this is what progress looks like, that this is what having better things requires. And in isolation, each adjustment makes sense. But together, they begin to reshape how life is lived. Rooms slowly stop being lived in and start being preserved. Closets become systems. Surfaces become off-limits. Objects gain rules. You start noticing when things don't return to their place. Disorder feels heavier than it used to. Not because you changed, but because the environment demands consistency. This is what Diderot realized too late. His old robe was forgiving. It belonged to his life as it was. The new robe demanded alignment. It couldn't tolerate ink stains or careless movement. It forced him to change how he existed inside his own space. What he lost wasn't money alone. It was ease. Modern upgrades promise freedom, better tools, better experiences, better lives. But many of them quietly do the opposite. They increase the cost of spontaneity. They raise the penalty for mess. They turn living into a form of maintenance. You begin curating instead of inhabiting. And because this happens gradually, it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like responsibility, like growth, like maturity. But something subtle is being traded away. You begin protecting the environment more than you enjoy it. You start planning around objects instead of using them. At this stage, the question isn't whether the purchase was worth the money. That question is already too small. The real cost shows up elsewhere in the constant awareness, the narrow choices, the background tension of keeping things intact. You didn't stop being free in one moment. You adjusted, then adjusted again, until one day, without deciding to, you became the caretaker of the life you were supposed to be living. The way out isn't dramatic. There's no purge, no rejection of comfort, no vow to live with nothing. That kind of reaction only creates another identity to maintain. The real shift is quieter than that. It begins by lowering the baseline. Most people try to control spending by controlling decisions. They promise to be more disciplined, to think harder before buying. But discipline fails when the environment keeps asking for upgrades. The pressure doesn't come from impulse. It comes from exposure, from constantly living next to things that set standards you didn't choose deliberately. Lowering the baseline means changing what sets the reference point in your life. Before buying anything new, you pause and ask a different question. Not do I want this, but what else will this make visible? What will feel out of place once this enters the room? What will it quietly ask to be replaced? You're not calculating price anymore. You're tracing consequences. Then comes a limit, not on money, but on accumulation. When something new arrives, something old leaves. Not because the old thing is useless, but because keeping both forces comparison. Comparison is what fuels the spiral. By removing the old, you prevent the environment from splitting into versions that compete with each other. You keep coherence intact. The most effective shift, though, is intentional humility in visible places. Not deprivation, restraint. When the most obvious items in your life are simple, forgiving, and functional, everything else relaxes around them. There's less pressure to align, less need to explain, less cost to exist comfortably. This is why some people seem immune to lifestyle inflation. It's not that they earn less or want less. It's that their identity isn't anchored to objects that demand upkeep. Their lives have room for friction, mess, spontaneity. They can use things freely because the things don't require protection. Lowering the baseline restores asymmetry. You become larger than your possessions again. They return to being tools instead of standards. You stop managing the environment and start moving through it. Nothing about this looks impressive from the outside. And that's the point. When the need to signal disappears, so does most of the pressure to spend. Life becomes cheaper not because you're doing less, but because fewer things are negotiating with you. Diderot didn't need a new philosophy. He needed his old robe back, not the fabric, the relationship, the freedom to exist without maintaining appearances. You don't need to reject modern life to escape the spiral. You just need to stop letting objects decide what feels acceptable. When the baseline is low, upgrades lose their power. And for the first time, your life belongs to you again.